traffic information need. Oh, yeah, I think I knew that. And say, let's imagine that we're searching for information about mountains near Zermatt. And if we want to do this, irrespective of how we actually implement it, we have to do some different things. We have to generalize this into a query, or typically that's what people did, where we have to work out what the theme is, what sort of spatial relationship we're talking about, and what location. And whether that's handled as a single thing, like an LLM might nowadays do it, or whether it's handled as different components doesn't really matter. But if we think about the operationalization, there are kind of three key tasks. The first one is that we need to know which Zermatt is relevant to this query. So the query is actually underspecified because there may be more than one Zermatt. The second thing is we need to operationalize what we mean by a region that's near Zermatt. So we need to somehow define that. And the third is that we need to find content documents in the case that I'm interested in that describe mountains. So we need to know what that concept means in the region near Zermatt. And that requires us to do a bunch of things. So the first thing that we typically have to do for a task like this is what's called toponym recognition and resolution. We've just released a Python package called the empirical geoparser, which does this using transformer architectures. I'm involved in editing a special issue of IJGIS about these sorts of methods, where probably more than 50% of the papers are about the first part, so toponym recognition, so working out that a word refers to a place name, and resolution is which of the Zermatts we're referring to. So this is very much still an area where there's a lot of development going on, and people are very excited about using large language models for doing this, for example, but where we're still not so good as we'd like to be. And actually this visualization shows you quite nicely how well this empirical geoparser works. It's actually analyzing all the place names that are mentioned in Around the World in 80 days. The second task is operationalizing nearness. So here you can see some points, and those points are actually points that are derived from online adverts for products, and they're associated with, for instance, Cardiff. And if we do that for many regions that are near one another, we can generate many bounding boxes, and those bounding boxes might overlap with one another. And if they do that, we can then use qualitative spatial relationships to, for instance, operationalize nearness as being, for example, a partial overlap. So if we've got the case PO there, where the region X and the region Y overlap with one another, then we might say, well, that's equivalent to nearness. And if we had two disconnected regions, so on the far left there, X and Y, then we would say, well, those are definitely not near, and so on. And then we need to extract our relevant documents. There's lots of different ways of doing this. This is some work on London, where we were looking at different events and how those events were related to different places in London, and using lots of different views on the data. So what sort of people are the people, locals or tourists? What days of the week? What semantics are they using, and so on. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, all the steps in the pipeline that I've just kind of talked about have been implemented by lots of different people. So one question that we might ask is, well, what theory can we use to help with this, and how does theory perhaps help us? And I want to talk about some different things. So the first thing was in my title was place. And there's a lot of theory about place from different people, from human geography, but also lots of other fields. But one important thing about place is that we give names to meaningful places, and we do that so that they can be shared. And because we give places names, we use language to communicate about places and not geometry. So I think that's, like, for me, a very important fundamental thing. When we talk about place, the way that humans naturally communicate and discuss places is not using geometric representations, but rather semantic representations. And that has all sorts of implications. When we think about toponym recognition and resolution, the same referent can be referred to by multiple different toponyms. So we can have the same place and it has different names. Referents can be spatially vague, so they don't have sharp borders. We can use toponyms in a vernacular sense, so they're not necessarily in official databases. They can be used at different scales, and scale can be very important in this. A lot of representations, computational representations, are based around the notion of points of interest, and often the points of interest are exactly that, are points, but not all place names represent points. They can represent things at very different scales. They change over time and in space. And Carl Grossner, I think, gave a talk in this series not so long ago where I think he talked much more about historical use of place names. And then reference can also share the same toponym. And this cartoon here actually is a Swiss cartoon. It's about place names in Switzerland, where the cantons are responsible for delivering place names, a particular sort of place names, to the federal government. And they decided to give names in what we would call Mundart, so in Swiss German as opposed to in High German. And then all the issues that occur when you do this, when the names change because it's decided that other names are better, right? If we think about qualitative spatial reasoning, that's the way that we appear to reason about space, that people appear to reason about space. And this little Lego diagram is supposed to illustrate some of this. So for instance, my little Lego character is saying I'm on the right bank of the river because the true left and true right bank of a river people would traditionally define by the direction of flow, right? So in GI science, we often make this statement that topology matters and metric refines. I think that was originally from Egenhofer and Mark. But there's lots of evidence actually that in different cultures, people use very different strategies to describe spatial relationships. So they don't necessarily always use relative frames of reference or absolute frames of reference. Sometimes we use a mix, sometimes only one is used. So when we want to deal with spatial language, thinking that one way of dealing with it is going to work presumes that cultures all do this in the same way, which we know not to be the case. Naive geography, which was also popularized by Egenhofer and Mark, was the idea of looking at formal models of the common sense geographic world. And I think this is very interesting and quite important, and I try and show you why here. So this picture is taken quite a long time ago now, is of my son, and he's pointing up here. This is a mountain called Grossmieten. And my son, who was then maybe 5 or 6, has no problem with the fact that that's a mountain. And he also has no problem with the fact that the mountain is somehow an object. He could count them. If he was to turn to his right, he would say there's Kleinmieten, and now there's 2 mountains, so they're somehow countable objects. Despite the fact that if you were to ask him where the mountain started, he probably couldn't tell you. And that's very typical of naive or folk disciplines that seem to work with these object-based representations that contradict more continuous models like we can see here. These are the global ecological land units, and those are based on things like bioclimate and landform and so on, where we have continuous fields representing space, right? So that's quite important, again, if we want to model things, because if we think about remote sensing data, for instance, it's predominantly field-based representations. And if we want to turn that into something that's similar to how people think, we probably have to turn it into an object-based representation. And then the last of these bits of theory that I think is helpful and useful for the things we are doing are so-called basic levels. So basic levels are abstractions of the world that people find useful in some way. So for example, that you might say something was a chair, or I'm sitting in front of my desk, rather than saying I'm sitting in front of some furniture, which would be a sort of higher order level, or that I'm sitting on a desk chair, which would be a very specific thing. And it turns out that these basic levels are not independent of language, and they're not independent of culture. So for example, forest can mean very different things in different languages. And these differences have big implications both at local and at global scale. So this is, for example, a fairly scraggy looking Scottish forest that in some countries people might not consider to be forests at all, and in other countries might be a very advanced form of forest. So what I want to do now is I want to sort of start to transfer from this theory to thinking about ways that we can deal with some of this. So I want to do a little thought experiment first of all. And the thought experiment is that you all close your eyes and think of somewhere special. And Maybe if you now open your eyes, maybe you imagined a place like this. So a fairly beautiful, sort of traditional looking Swiss landscape. You probably didn't think of somewhere like this. This is a place in Scotland. I really like this picture because it's a gate, and the gate has a big sign on it that tells you not to go through it. And I think that's very typical of the sort of contradictions that we sometimes find in landscapes and about place, right? It's so obvious that people want to go here that we have an affordance telling us to go through with a sign on it telling us not to. And then maybe you thought about somewhere like this. This is in Zurich. This is where all the kids go at the moment to go sledging in the winter time. And when you thought about those places, you maybe didn't just have pictures in your head. Maybe you were inspired by the mountains. Maybe you felt the rain, or maybe you heard the children who were excited. And if you were Scottish, maybe you wanted to coorie doon. So coorie doon is means to sort of be in a warm, cozy place and eat something nice, maybe. Or maybe if you're German or Swiss, you say ein Stück Heimat. Yeah. So what I want to get over here is the idea that when we think about places that are special, and particularly landscapes that are special, we don't just need to think about what we see, but other senses, and also that there are concepts that might be specific to different languages and different cultures that are important. So now I want to kind of try and make the link between the stuff that I've told you so far and between these concepts of place, language, and landscape a bit more specifically. And I want to start by telling you about the European Landscape Convention. And I think that's very important because in the European Landscape Convention, the definition of landscape is an area that's perceived by people and whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. In other words, landscape isn't just what's there, it's what we perceive as being there, and we're part of the landscape. If we look at some ethnological work, so Johnson and Hoon, they said landscape isn't a mere substrate or a bundle of resources, but instead it's invested with a framework of deep meaning. So very important that landscapes have meaning to us in different sorts of ways. And if we look at Pascal and colleagues, who are very important in terms of things like ecosystem services and nature contributions to people, they talked about these different ways that people have understanding to nature and its many values. And although that started to be acknowledged in policy, there's lots of work that we need to do to consider this diversity, right? And part of my argument would be that a very good way of doing that is through language. So what does it mean to do this through language? How can we actually do it? Well, one obvious way is we can look at the things that people name, that people actually describe in landscapes, and not just the names in terms of proper names, but the generic terms that they use to carve the landscape up. So David Mark and Barry Smith, in their work on what they termed ethnophysiography, and they talked about this idea that people from different language groups and different cultures have different ways, and that you can really discover this by looking at how things are named. So this is actually, so I can't say it, Kauchen is a Gaelic word, and it's a word for a drainage channel, if you like, in a boggy area of land that's barely visible. And it doesn't really matter what language and what culture you go to, you'll find examples like this. So for instance, in Switzerland, there's a term called Tobel, and a Tobel is something like a gorge, but in Germany, people don't use it, right? And a Tobel is something that's kind of hard to get across and so on. It doesn't matter where you go, you find examples of these things. If you want to go a bit further, though, than just looking at individual examples, you need to do some sort of systematic experiment. So with a bunch of colleagues, we did a systematic experiment where we asked people to list landscape terms. So it's a the method is called free listing. And we looked at the order in which those terms were listed. So if you look across here at maybe at English, the most common terms were things like mountain and hill and tree and grass and field. And you can see that people often said mountain and then said hill because in the network they're connected. Or if they said tree, often the next or the previous term was grass and so on. And if you look a little bit more at some other languages, you can see, for instance, down here in Italian, we have montagna and collina, which are more or less equivalent terms. And then we also have here mare, so the equivalent of sea. And if you look in English, sea is much less common and it's much less connected to mountain and hill. Whereas in French, actually, you have montagne and mer. So you have something kind of similar to what's going on in Italian. So what we can see here is the domain of landscape as a domain described by many people, and we can see that there are similarities and differences. And what it actually turns out is that in these experiments, we also asked people to list body parts and animals, and they find it harder to list landscape parts, and they're less consistent in the ordering that they do it. But we find differences between the languages. So there seem to be some differences in the way that landscape is conceptualized, but we don't really know very much about what those differences are. So then we did some more experiments where instead of asking people what terms they used to describe landscape, we actually asked people how they experienced landscape. So we used words from these lists and we used them in, I think, English and French and German, if I remember correctly. And we asked them, for instance, the extent to which they experience these through different senses. So, for instance, how much they hear, or they taste, or they feel, or they smell, or they see through different body parts. So their feet, their hands and their arms, their heads, their mouths, and their torsos, and then through different emotions. So valence is happiness, arousal is basically how excited you are, and dominance is how in control or controlled by the landscape you find yourself to be. And here you can see just three terms in German and in English, so sea, reservoir, and swamp. And you can see that they seem to be broadly similar. They're not exactly the same. They seem to be broadly similar. But if we do it for many, many terms, we can start to look at similarities and differences. And so, for example, here, what we see are the emotions for water-related terms in German here and in English here. And here we actually find some differences, and we find the biggest differences when we do these experiments in terms of emotions. So in terms of body parts and in terms of senses between the European languages, the small number of European languages that we looked at, we didn't find very big differences. We found somewhat more differences in terms of emotions. So in particular here, there's a sort of pocket of quiet, happy places that we find in English that we didn't really find in the same way in German. And what this all tells us is that, first of all, landscape categories matter, right? So if you want to write policy documents about landscape, the categories you choose are clearly going to have consequences, and translation is maybe more complicated than we might think. However, in these European languages, landscape as a domain is overall broadly similar. When we look, though, at these different ratings, the sensory, the motor, and the emotional ones, and compare them, we find more difference in the emotional ratings. And that's kind of interesting because the emotional ratings might be the things that most influence how much people are likely or less likely to accept, for example, a policy, right? So emotions are very bound up in concepts related to place. So sense of place is at least partly all about our feelings about our experiences of places, and that in turn is probably very strongly related to the acceptance or the lack of acceptance for a particular policy in a landscape. So what I want to kind of finish by doing in the last 5-10 minutes is say something about then how can we go beyond these examples where I hope I've convinced you that language can tell us about landscape and that language gives us access to a diversity of ways of understanding landscape, and think a bit about how we can operationalize the use of language to represent landscape and place. So actually some things we can do with this. And I'm going to do that by showing two different examples. The first example kind of goes back to quite a lot of what I've shown already because it is concerned with the objects that people find in a landscape. And the second one is concerned with something that has a lot to do with sense of place, and particularly sense of place in an English-speaking context, which is to do with what people call tranquility, right? So peaceful places that people go to recharge. So if you know about attention restoration theory, so tranquil places should somehow be the sorts of places you might want to go to then. So to do all this, we use a whole bunch of different corpora. So these might include corpora that are specialized. So for instance, Text and Berg is a collection of alpine writing from the Swiss Alpine Club in Switzerland. The Corpus of Lake District Writing is a collection of writing about the English Lake District that is historic. We use newspaper articles, and we also sometimes build corpora of, for example, first-person description. So a corpus where people actually describe their own experiences in the first person. Then we're using a bunch of natural language processing methods. Those methods could now very much be AI based. It doesn't really matter what the methods are, in my opinion. What is, though, important is that we need labeled data. Whether we need labeled data to train or not is maybe less of an issue now, but we need labeled data to evaluate. They're indispensable. And we typically adopt what we call a multiscalar approach. That means that when we do these sorts of things, we combine microanalysis, so close reading, with macroanalysis with computational methods. So the first example I said was looking at landscape objects. So the framing for this, the sort of motivation for it, is to do with these ethnophysiographic methods and to do with this idea of place. And we're looking really in terms of place here at locale. We're looking at what's there. And what we actually wanted to do was identify, then locate in particular locations, rank and compare the biophysical terms used to describe Swiss mountain landscapes. And we did that using two corpora, actually, the Swiss Alpine Club yearbooks that go back to 1864 and hiking blogs that are kind of more contemporary. And the first thing we do is we extract the terms that are used to describe these landscapes. That's this identification stage. And you can see, for instance, it's not very surprising. The most common term is the summit or the peak, and then mountains, Alps, glaciers, cliffs and rocks, ridges, and so on. So this is kind of, yeah, okay. These are the terms that people are using in this corpus to describe these landscapes. To locate them, we have to do this toponym recognition and resolution that I talked about before, and then we end up with a map, a representation of where people are talking about these mountains. That's also somewhat obvious that they're going to be talking about this in the Alps. But what's more interesting is being able to rank and compare these things. So we can compare the Text and Berg, Swiss Alpine Club data, with Hecker, and we can see, for example, that in Hecker, things like forest are much more, so Wald is forest, are much more important than the Swiss Alpine Club, probably because in this corpus where people are describing their hikes, they're more describing places in the Mittelland and not in the high mountains. We can also see that here they talk a lot about Grat. So Grat means ridge. So that's an affordance. Basically, you can walk along a ridge. And in the Swiss Alpine Club corpus, they talk a lot more about the properties of the mountains as well. So you find something a bit more like a land cover map. And if we go a step further, then we can actually compare these different corpora for different grid cells. And down here, we actually have the representation you would get if you did the same thing using Corine, the Corine land cover map, or Arealstatistik, which is a land cover map from Switzerland, with these semantic representations that we are able to generate for similar places. And if we generate these semantic representations, then we can also measure similarity. So what we can do is we can extract these landscape features, the locale in terms of place, we can locate them. According to the corpus we use, we see things change. We see, for example, affordances in Hecker particularly. These descriptions are quite spatially coarse, but as I hope I persuaded you, they're semantically very rich. And then we can compare them to other representations. So they tell us much more about how people think about these landscapes than top-down representations like Corine land cover data. The second example, and the last example I want to talk about, is this idea of analysing tranquility. And we actually did this in the Lake District in England. And here the framing is something called landscape character assessment, which is a method that's used in the UK, but also some other European countries. They sometimes call it slightly different things, as a way of basically measuring or capturing what's important in landscapes, and then that's often flows into planning. What's also important in terms of this framing are so-called cultural ecosystem services, so the non-material benefits that landscapes give us, and that relates then to sense of place. And here what we have to do is we first of all have to identify ways in which people describe what they perceive in the landscape. We have to locate them again, and then we need to classify what tranquility actually is, and we are interested in how positive or negative people are about that tranquility. And here the collections are a little bit different. We used Geograph, which was or is a collection of pictures with descriptions, and then a more general web corpus to get these first-person descriptions as well. This wheel shows you different dimensions of landscape character assessment, and you can see here this perceptual and aesthetic, and for instance, preferences and sounds and memories and associations, and that's kind of the area we're working in. And if we look at cultural services, you can see things like recreation or sense of place or inspiration, but you don't really see on either of these tranquility specifically. If we then look at what we actually have to do, this flowchart is just really supposed to show you that there's quite a lot of steps involved in doing this sort of analysis, because it's quite challenging to extract these descriptions. What we end up with is about 28,000 descriptions that we could extract that refer to things that people saw, about 1,500 that refer to things that people heard, and about 80 that refer to smell. If we look at what people see, then you can see, for instance, they often talk about things like views and going up or down or paths and so on. And the scenic ones are much more prominent than the unattractive ones. So what this means is that in these sorts of data and in this sort of place, we have a so-called positivity bias. So people don't talk so much about what they don't like. But what we're particularly interested in here is this idea of tranquility. And actually, when we analyzed these data, what we found was quite often that people talked about tranquility in different ways. So they talk about, for instance, tranquil sounds. So a tranquil sound might be hearing birdsong or hearing a river. They talk about total silence, but they also talk about a lack of movement or sounds that contrast with one another, or they talk about combining what they can see with what they can hear. We can also go further and we can classify this into different sorts. So we can, for example, talk about anthrophony, so sounds that are made by us, by people, biophony, sounds that are made by animals, and geophony, sounds that are made by the landscape itself, so the wind in the trees or a waterfall. And we can automatically do all these different sorts of classification. And if we do that, we end up with something like this. So what you see here are each of these points is actually a description where in some way a tranquil experience is being described. So if we go up here on the top right, so right by the A66, that's the name of a road, but quiet nevertheless. Okay, so that's a description of tranquility by contrast. That's this pink color here. So it's being compared to something. And down here, again, you can see something similar. This peaceful valley is popular with the Royal Air Force for low-level flying practice. But the drumming of the rotors is brief and peace is restored quickly. So again, it's an example of contrast. And contrast turns out to be quite common. We have these other things. We have combination. So I think over here we have a combination example where the early morning calm was breathtaking and a water bird decided to swim. Its wake, so the movement accentuated the stillness. So that's a different sort of tranquility. And it turns out if we take a map of relative tranquility, so these colors, these greens and reds, these are actually modeled tranquility using a sort of GIS-based model, then what we see is that our contrast tranquility has the least tranquility according to this model. So what we are finding is we're finding that places where people describe tranquility agree with a model of tranquility and agree with the model of tranquility in the sense that those places are actually kind of more disturbed, but they're still found to be tranquil. So we would make this differentiation between sort of modeled or potential tranquility, which is this continuous representation in these colors, and these points, these places that people actually found to be tranquil, which we would call experienced tranquility. So these potential and experienced tranquility differ in important ways. And to find that out, we need to use language or we need to ask people. So language is a really good route to finding that. And the other key result here is that I kind of showed you that on these models, tranquility wasn't really there as a thing in its own right. And it turns out it's a very important landscape value that people care about a lot, and maybe it should be there. So I want to kind of wrap up. Our work's grounded in this need to better understand, better capture different ways that people experience landscape, and we want to do that by using language. We combine, I hope you've sort of got a bit of a sense for that. You can ask me questions if you like. We combine very different methods. So we combine field work with empirical experiments and computational analysis. So our work is very interdisciplinary. That means we also work with lots of different people. Language gives us a very rich but also a complex source to analyze these sorts of things across both space and time. And our methods can benefit, and I hope I persuaded you of that too, from using existing theory and frameworks. So just because something is digital doesn't mean it necessarily has to be new. I want to wrap up there. The QR code is for a book called Unlocking Environmental Narratives, where if you're interested in these sorts of things, it's an open source book that you can download where I was involved and a bunch of other people. Okay, thanks a lot, and I hope there are maybe a few questions.
Very much. Oh, I'm coming in. Thank you very much, Ross. That was a really, really good presentation, very rich. There's already been some questions and discussion in the chat. Just right before we go to that, I hope everybody hears me well enough. I just wanted to ask if there were any immediate questions, and otherwise I'll start going through the chat questions. If there is, please just raise your hand and you can ask. Okay, well, surely there'll be something later because I think the discussion's going to be really rich looking at the questions. Going back to a question by Shuai Wang, he writes, I'm just going to read this fully so that, Ross, you can follow all of this. But there is barely a mountain here in the Netherlands. How come the Dutch speak this much about the berg, in quotation marks? I might have missed it. Where does this data come from? Could it be in the names? For example, Van den Berg.
So if I understand rightly, you're talking about the free listing experiment. Yeah, so you're talking about, I have to just quickly scroll back. Oh, I've gone too far, sorry. You're talking about this experiment because that's the only place I talked about Dutch. So the answer is, and this kind of other people have already found. So this experiment is a free listing experiment. So what you do is you say, Francis, I want you to list all the animals you can think of. And Francis then says lion, tiger, elephant, dog, cat, mouse, or something like that. And when you do this with landscape terms, these are the terms that Dutch speakers use. So mountains are very salient landscape terms in Dutch, independent of the fact that there are no mountains or not. Well, let's go with a Swiss perspective. There are no mountains there. If if you did this experiment in a slightly different way, which we've also done, so we've also done these experiments where we actually ask people not what's in a landscape, but what's in this landscape. So we do it outside somewhere, then they'll say something different. So if you did that experiment in front of a Dutch polder, they would start off by talking about polder and so on. And then actually what's very interesting is so the way that our mind, I don't know, I never like saying the way our mind works, but the way that people respond to this is that they'll usually start off by things that they see, and then they'll have associations, and then they might go on holiday, and then the Dutch people might also add mountains to their list, and then probably there'll be, we call them patches, there'll be a patch of related things, and they might say mountain and snow and gorge, even though you asked them about that landscape. That's what we found in our data when we did these experiments in situ. We did the experiments in situ in Swiss landscapes, I have to say, not in Dutch landscapes. But this experiment wasn't done in the landscape. This experiment was done sitting in front of a computer.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that explanation. Is there a follow-up question directly to that right away? Maybe. Yeah, no, not right now. So then we can move on to the next question. I'm not sure who asked it because it's an abbreviation here in the chat, but I'll read it so Ross, you're able to follow everything here. Which kinds of representations, excuse me, are needed to represent the concepts behind places other than language or frequency text-based vectors? It goes on, I agree we need a theory here, but I would expect that this theory needs to go beyond labels. Do you agree?
So yes, I don't. So that's a very so that when we work on place, we, for example, looked at ideas like location, locale, and sense of place as
Yeah.
ways of organizing the data. So some sort of um, fairly simple way of structuring information. I don't agree, or I would be very careful about having a top-down theory of what place is.
Mm.
And maybe I try and give you an example of why I think that's important. So I talked about forest before, right? And we work with linguists who are field linguists. And one of my colleagues works in Malaysia with an indigenous group. And if he asks them what the forest is, they're like, we don't really understand. And then he's like, well, the trees and everything. And they're like, well, they're the trees or whatever. And he's like, yeah, but what is this place? And they're like, well, we're this place. And the trees are this place. We're all this place, right? So I think we have to be very careful about imposing. For me, that's a bit the beauty of language as a source, right? That we can start to understand a little bit better how people conceptualize the world, but we have to be careful that we remember that there might be very, very different ways of conceptualizing the world. And whatever data model, whatever abstraction we choose, is going to constrain those ways of thinking about the world. And for that's why I don't know if we call them labels, but if we call them, it doesn't really matter. If we can stick with things that are not so far away from the concepts that people appear to be using, if we can agree that there are things called concepts, then maybe we don't go down this route of
Mm.
having representation. So, for instance, sharp borders that very much mix things up for. Oh, Simon's excited. Yeah, he's gonna
Okay,
do.
well,
Yeah.
so yeah, Simon is excited. He's raised his hand, so please let's continue this good discussion.
Yeah, just at this one, I wanted to actually jump into the discussion because so I agree. I mean, we need to be careful with imposing stuff on or theory on languages or on how people conceptualize things. I totally agree with that point. But I would argue that in order to make the point that there are differences in the first place. So I mean, you argued that there are there's distinctions in how people and languages conceptualize place.
Yeah.
In order to even know that that is the case, you need already a model, right? Because you are talking about representations. We're not talking about words. We're not
Yeah,
talking about
so
whether
I
people
agree. I mean,
use.
we have to have some form of abstraction. The question is how far you go, right? And
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I
Yeah.
don't think I disagree, but I think I'm So this commission's called ontologies, right? You know I'm a bit
Mm.
allergic to ontology, Simo, and there's a reason I'm allergic to ontology because I think it has been used to impose. So
Okay,
I think we have
sure.
to somehow find a place in between, and I don't
Sure.
know where that place is.
I think the allergy is well founded. I saying that as chair of this commission, ontology still can be helpful, but we have to be also acknowledge their limits. I think we should, though, perhaps even go further than what we've been doing here, and that is to talk about the indexicality of the terms we use to the experiences of the world around us and the indexicality as a helpful crutch, if I can put it that way, to facilitate human understanding. Without a concept such as hill or mountain that we both, and the people I'm talking to, I should better say, this share, then it can be very difficult to assess what we're going to be doing during the next 5 kilometers of hiking. We need those shared understandings, not just for the recreational activities such as hike, but also for our day-to-day understandings in ways where we don't want to problematize, we don't want to reflect about what the terms mean, but we just use them and somehow it corresponds to our experience, but our experiences can diverge from the terms. And I think from looking more at Umberto Eco's work in the last years, I wonder if that's not more an issue that surfaces in geography with geographical terms and our conceptual considerations and attempts to model those relationships. That the terms themselves are, you might simply say, ambiguous, but in actuality, that ambiguity serves an important role in making sure communication doesn't break down because the Dutch person talks to the Swiss person and the Swiss person says, that's not a mountain you're showing me here. Mountains have to be like your son was showing, this form. And the Dutch person says, yeah, but here it can be that. And then it's like, well, what do? You say, is it all locational based? I don't think so. I think we just need a way to understand the relationality, the contextual grounding of human communication and language. No, I'm not sure what others think about that.
May I add one more thing? Because there's also another reaction in the chat. But just want to say that
Yeah,
basically, when you're talking about theory, Ross, right? I think that needs to be the theory that we need to build, right? We need to understand how, if we want to understand how people differ in terms of their conceptualizations, we need to build conceptual models of how they differ, right? I mean, just and those
sure.
conceptual models need to go beyond the language itself because that's just a superficial representation of those concepts. So
Yeah,
there I'm getting back to the point that if we want to actually improve the theory, then that theory, of course, it needs to be developed. I would say, just I think that.
So for example, these experiments, so these are done with Asfa Majid, who's very well known in terms of linguistic diversity and so on. And that's exactly a way of going beyond just the label and looking at how the label is conceptualized, right? So you're looking at these different domains of how people think about these concepts. So I absolutely agree. Um,
yeah. Okay. The point that Tomasz Kubik made
yeah.
echoes what we've been talking about here. I think people can have gotten online and they can see the chat now. So I'll just paraphrase the sometimes semantic trees that are used in multilingual environments can be compared because they cannot be compared, sorry, because they arise in completely different cultural contexts. So I would ask the question here, Ross, about this display. I can't remember anymore what the colors stand for.
The colors are the different domains. So the blue is your
Uh,
senses, the red is the body parts, and the
uh,
green are the
okay,
emotions.
but it's in one language community. It's not in multiple language
Oh no,
communities.
the two columns, the left-hand column is German and the right-hand column is English.
Okay. So then this could be an example where there are strong parallels and
Yes.
similarities. Yeah.
For those three terms, we can see, And then the
Yeah.
question is, right, so for instance, mer and see are not exactly the same thing.
Right.
So these are, so we're
Mm.
not, that's important. We're not saying these terms are the same because they're not kind
Mm.
of similar, but they're not the same. But we can see that they appear to be conceptualized, to be thought about in fairly similar ways when we look at these different ways of doing it. So that
Mm.
would be um, one approach to doing this. You can
Yeah.
see, for instance, I mean, it's quite interesting if you look at Stausee or reservoir,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
little that's experienced through your senses in either language. You just see them. Whereas the
Right.
sea, you hear it, you feel it, you smell it. It's very, very different, right?
Right. But I'm wondering to what extent that's possibly, if I can ask this question, and it was several times I was thinking of this as a diegetic aspect of these labels, names that we're using. Sea isn't only something that means something because I'm trying to describe the North Sea or the Baltic Sea or the Zurich Sea, but it's also something because I am articulating a relationship between people, between a village, between culture, between a past, between a rich connections that I'm evoking by using the word sea. That isn't, excuse me if I misunderstood it, but it doesn't seem to be quite there in what you were looking at there, this rich diegetic scope
I
of
don't
what
know what
these words
diegetic
can.
means, but if I assume it means like something like sense of place,
Mm-mm.
no, what does
It's
it
more
mean?
what it's more like what you use in theater or in literature. When I'm talking about, I can look out my window here and see all the way to the North Sea. That means it's a diegetic sense. And if I'm doing that in a performance, like in a theater, then I'm
Yeah.
using that mode of language, European languages, to be able to spell out a sense, an expanse of space and place
Uh-huh.
that no one has to see or they don't have to visualize it or represent it in the visual sense. It is there in that evocation.
I don't
So it's
know.
a yeah. So it's a different aspect. It's a very interesting aspect that's been taken up many times in theatric studies of theater, actually, interestingly enough, but it's not, it's one that's a very rich aspect of our human communication about places and spatial geographical relationships and in modes of performance, for example, in theater or
Yeah.
literature.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know enough about that. I think
Yeah,
I
it's really interesting. Might be something that I could only suggest is interesting to look a little bit more on. Also for conceptual work, because I know, yeah, Tomasz is here and Simon, who do more conceptual work. I think there too, it's interesting to consider how we can broaden the scope of what we're looking at and consider those aspects. Yeah, this has been really interesting. Let me just double check before we get too much into this discussion right now, if there's other points that people
there's
wanted to
another
add.
question. So
Is
there's
there,
a question about the relative position of toponyms. The answer is that we
but
did
thanks.
do some work where we looked at that, not particularly here, and we didn't do it so much. Now I have to remember, we did it, we looked at, no, we did. So we looked at symmetry. So in
Mhm.
principle, we looked a little bit at what you're saying. So we looked at symmetry or asymmetry in spatial relationships. So that's kind of how often which reference were used in which relationships, um, but I can't remember more than that if I'm really honest. But that's actually something that you can do quite nicely with these sorts of data.
Mm, okay, okay. You say you can do it quite nicely. Does that mean you would do it in the future or you have done it in the past?
It means that these sorts of spatial relationships turn up a lot in these sorts of corpora,
Okay,
particularly in landscape
right,
corpora,
right,
and you can if you can analyze these sorts of spatial relationships, you need to then have, so it would come back a bit, you need to have a model of what you're going to call large and what you're going to call small and how you're going to do that, and it's not necessarily so trivial. Um,
right, right, right. Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. maybe another question that ties into that in some ways, as you mentioned, Karl Grossner, who talked about the World Historical Gazetteer, and they're looking at place names, toponyms. And I was wondering, when you're looking at these GI, coming from this GI retrieval background and looking at how World Historical Gazetteer has taken a multiple perspective approach to the way place names are valid for
Yeah.
individual features, if there's any connection you see between those multiple values or multiple perspectives, better is a better way to phrase it, I think, and the toponyms.
Yes. So if I just go back to here. So
Mm,
the Arco geoparser, the way that this tool actually works is it
mm,
generates basically it uses gazetteers, and it doesn't really matter what gazetteer, to generate candidate sentences, and it compares the candidate sentences to the documents. And
okay.
if the candidate sentences have multiple perspectives in them, that'll
Mm.
increase the
Ah,
similarity, right? So that's
okay.
exactly so computationally in the end, that's exactly what we're doing. We're we're not trying to match things exactly. We're rather comparing lots of representations by generating lots of possible candidates. And
Okay.
if there's multiple ways of naming the same place, then your candidates would include that, and your document you were trying to match on would presumably also, or you would hope, that's what you hope, would include
Mm,
some of that context. Um,
right. Okay.
and that's been done in a sort of transformer architecture. So this Urkel geoparser is now
Yeah.
built so that you can um, add any gazetteer to it. So you could add
Ah, okay.
the World Historical Gazetteer to it if you wanted, and then you apply it to historical data.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Good. There's another question from Simon. How did you generate the candidate toponyms?
So based on gazetteers, Simon. So it's really so you basically take you so the implemented model, or the instantiated model, I should say, uses geonames, and we've also done it with Swiss names in Switzerland. But you can just basically use any gazetteer. So the candidate sentences are generated from gazetteers, and they're compared to the dot. So we then do toponym recognition and resolution, but we do it in one step using sentence transformers. Um,
Hmm. Okay. Okay. I think you've got the references at the bottom. I hope in the slides that we'll also post with a copy of the recording of your presentation, that there'll be all the references in the PDF file.
you can hope. If
Well, hope you.
if somebody would like the references and they can't find them with the references like that, I'm happy to help. But
Okay,
but
thank
no,
you.
there isn't a long reference list at the end of the talk. I'm afraid I'm too lazy. Um,
Okay, on that note, I thank you very, very much, because it was a big effort to make this, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I hope everybody can join me and thanking um, for this wonderful presentation. I'm looking for the special button I keep for these events. There we go. There it comes. You're seeing the
Thanks
hands
a lot.
clap. Yeah, yeah. It was really, really a really good presentation. Thanks so much, Ross. And thanks everybody for the discussion and question. We don't have a plan yet for the next presentation, but we will inform you and let you know when we're going to have the next presentation. For now, once again, please join me in thanking Ross Purves for the really interesting talk today. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks to you all. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Cheers.